The Louisiana sun beat down mercilessly on the cotton fields of Magnolia Grove Plantation in the summer of 1860, its rays creating a shimmering haze that made the endless rows of white bowls appear to dance in the oppressive heat. Joanna wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of dirt across her dark skin as she continued picking cotton under the watchful eye of the overseer, Thomas Whitman. At 28 years old, Joanna had spent her entire life on this plantation, born into bondage, like her mother before her and her grandmother before that. She was tall and strong, with calloused hands that spoke of decades of hard labor and eyes that held a fierce intelligence that her masters had tried unsuccessfully to break. Unlike many of the other enslaved people on the plantation, Joanna could read, a skill she had learned in secret from the plantation owner's daughter years ago, before the girl had been sent away to finishing school. "Move faster, girl!" Whitman's voice cracked like a whip across the field. "Master Beauregard expects his quota filled by sundown, and you're falling behind." Joanna's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. She had learned long ago that speaking back to the overseer only brought more pain, not just for herself, but for the others who worked alongside her. Instead, she channeled her anger into her work, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency as she stripped the cotton bolls from their stems and stuffed them into the large sack that hung from her shoulder. Around her, 50 other enslaved people worked in similar silence, their movements creating a rhythm that had become as familiar as breathing. There was old Samuel, whose back was permanently bent from 40 years of fieldwork. Young Mary, barely 16 and already showing signs of the exhaustion that would mark her life. And Big Jim, whose massive frame hid a gentle soul that had been battered by years of cruelty. The plantation itself was a sprawling estate that covered over 3,000 acres of prime Louisiana farmland. The main house, a grand antebellum mansion with white columns and wraparound porches, sat on a hill overlooking the fields, like a monument to the wealth built on human suffering. Behind it stood the overseer's house, the slave quarters, a collection of ramshackle cabins that housed entire families in single rooms, and the various outbuildings that supported the plantation's operations. Master Edmund Beauregard was a man who prided himself on his genteel southern manners and his profitable cotton operation. At 55, he was considered one of the most successful planters in the parish, a status that came at the cost of the humanity of those he owned. He was known for his quick temper and his belief that enslaved people needed to be kept in line through fear and violence. As the day wore on, Joanna's mind wandered to the conversations she had been having in secret with some of the other enslaved people. Word had been spreading through the slave quarters about the growing tensions between the North and South, about something called abolition, and about enslaved people in other places who had fought for their freedom. The knowledge that there was a world beyond the plantation, a world where people like her could be free, had planted a seed of hope in Joanna's heart that grew stronger with each passing day. "Joanna!" The sharp voice of Mistress Beauregard cut through her thoughts. The plantation owner's wife was standing at the edge of the field, her pale skin protected by a wide-brimmed hat and a parasol, her elaborate dress a stark contrast to the simple, rough clothing worn by the people working in the field. Joanna straightened up and walked over to where the white woman stood, keeping her eyes downcast, as she had been taught from childhood. "Yes, mistress? Master Beauregard wants to see you in the big house immediately," Mistress Beauregard said, her voice carrying the imperious tone that came from a lifetime of being obeyed without question. "And clean yourself up first. You look like you've been rolling in the dirt." Joanna's stomach tightened with apprehension. Being summoned to the big house was never a good sign. She made her way to the slave quarters, where she quickly washed her face and hands in the basin of water that served the entire cabin she shared with 3 other women. The cabin was barely 12 feet square, with a dirt floor and walls that let in the wind and rain. 4 wooden bunks lined the walls, and a small fireplace provided the only source of heat during the winter months. "What you think Master want with you?" asked Sarah, one of her cabin mates, as Joanna tried to make herself presentable. "Don't know," Joanna replied, but her mind was racing with possibilities, none of them good. Had someone seen her teaching young Timothy to read? Had word gotten back to the master about the secret meetings some of the enslaved people had been holding to discuss the rumors of freedom? The walk to the big house felt like the longest of Joanna's life. The mansion loomed before her, its white columns and grand facade a symbol of everything that kept her and her people in chains. She entered through the servants' entrance and was directed to Master Beauregard's study, a room lined with books that she longed to read and furnished with expensive furniture that represented more wealth than she could imagine. Master Beauregard was sitting behind his massive oak desk, his pale blue eyes cold and calculating as they fixed on Joanna. He was a large man with graying hair and a beard that he kept meticulously groomed, dressed in the finest clothes that money could buy. Behind him hung a portrait of his ancestors, a reminder of the generations of wealth and privilege that had been built on the backs of people like Joanna. "Joanna," he said, his voice deceptively calm, "I've been hearing some disturbing reports about you." "Sir?" Joanna kept her voice steady, though her heart was pounding. "My overseer tells me that you've been talking to the other slaves about things that are none of your concern, things about the North, about abolition, about ideas that could be dangerous to the order of this plantation." Joanna remained silent, knowing that anything she said could be used against her. "I want you to understand something," Beauregard continued, standing up and walking around the desk to stand directly in front of her. "This plantation is my domain, and everyone on it belongs to me. That includes you, Joanna. You are my property, just like my horses or my cotton gin, and I will not tolerate any behavior that threatens my investment." The words hit Joanna like physical blows, but she forced herself to remain still and silent. "However," Beauregard said, his tone becoming almost conversational, "I'm not an unreasonable man. I recognize that you're more intelligent than most of your kind, and that intelligence could be useful to me. I'm prepared to offer you a position in the big house, working as a personal servant to my wife. It would mean better food, better accommodations, and less physical labor." Joanna's mind raced as she considered the offer. A position in the big house would indeed be easier than field work, but it would also mean being under constant supervision, cut off from the other enslaved people who were beginning to share her dreams of freedom. "All you have to do," Beauregard continued, "is report to me any conversations you hear about escape, about rebellion, about anything that might threaten the peace and order of my plantation. Think of it as being my eyes and ears among your people." The request hit Joanna like a slap in the face. He was asking her to become a spy, to betray her own people in exchange for slightly better treatment. The very idea made her stomach turn with revulsion. "I need an answer, Joanna," Beauregard said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Will you accept my generous offer, or will you continue to be a source of trouble for me?" Joanna looked up and met his eyes for the first time, seeing the cruelty and arrogance that lay behind his civilized facade. In that moment, something inside her crystallized into a hard, unbreakable resolve. "No, sir," she said quietly. "I won't spy on my people." Beauregard's face darkened with anger. "I see. Well then, perhaps you need some time to reconsider your position." He walked over to a bell pull and gave it a sharp tug. Within moments, Thomas Whitman appeared in the doorway, his face already showing anticipation of what was to come. "Mr. Whitman," Beauregard said coldly, "it seems that Joanna needs a reminder of her place. 20 lashes should help clarify her thinking." "Yes, sir," Whitman replied with obvious satisfaction. "Should I do it now?" "Immediately, and make sure the other slaves can see. I want them to understand what happens to those who forget their station." As Whitman grabbed Joanna's arm and began to drag her toward the door, she felt something break inside her, not her spirit, but her last connection to the hope that things might change through patience and endurance. The system that held her people in bondage was not going to reform itself. It was not going to be moved by appeals to conscience or humanity. It was going to have to be destroyed. As they walked toward the whipping post that stood in the center of the slave quarters, Joanna began to plan. She thought about the conversation she had been having with Big Jim and old Samuel, about the layout of the plantation, about where the weapons were kept, about the routines of the overseers. She thought about the stories she had heard of successful slave rebellions in other places, and about the underground railroad that helped enslaved people escape to freedom in the North. But most of all, she thought about the 50 people who shared her bondage, who deserved the chance to taste freedom even if it meant risking everything to get it. The whip cracked across her back, sending waves of fire through her body. But Joanna gritted her teeth and refused to cry out. Each lash only strengthened her resolve, each moment of pain adding fuel to the fire that was building in her heart. As the punishment ended and she was left tied to the post as an example to the others, Joanna began to whisper to those who came near her, sharing her plan in fragments and pieces that would eventually come together into something that would shake the very foundations of Magnolia Grove Plantation. The uprising was about to begin. 3 weeks after the whipping, Joanna moved through the slave quarters like a ghost, her back still bearing the scars of Master Beauregard's punishment, but her spirit burning brighter than ever. The physical pain had healed, but the humiliation and injustice had transformed into something far more dangerous. A cold, calculating determination that spread like wildfire through the enslaved community. The slave quarters came alive after dark in ways that the white overseers never suspected. While Whitman and his assistants retired to their comfortable homes, believing their charges were too exhausted from the day's labor to cause trouble, Joanna was building a network of resistance that would have terrified them had they known of its existence. "We can't keep living like this," she whispered to Big Jim as they sat in the darkness outside his cabin, their voices barely audible above the chorus of crickets and nightbirds. "Every day we wait, more of our people die. Old Martha passed last week from exhaustion, and young Peter's back may never heal right after that beating he took for dropping a cotton sack." Big Jim nodded grimly. At 35, he was one of the strongest men on the plantation. His massive frame, the result of years of heavy labor and a naturally powerful build. But more importantly, he was respected by the other enslaved people for his wisdom and his unwavering moral compass. "I hear you, Joanna," he said quietly. "But we got to be smart about this. If we move too fast or make mistakes, it won't just be us who pay the price. They'll take it out on everyone, the children, the old folks, everyone. That's exactly why we have to succeed," Joanna replied, her voice carrying a fierce intensity. "We're not just fighting for ourselves, we're fighting for all of them." Over the following nights, their circle of conspirators grew carefully and deliberately. Old Samuel, despite his bent back and graying hair, brought decades of wisdom and knowledge about the plantation's routines. Mary, the 16-year-old field hand, surprised everyone with her quick thinking and her ability to move unnoticed through the big house where she sometimes worked as a cleaning girl. "I know where Master keeps his guns," Mary whispered during one of their secret meetings in the old tobacco barn that had been abandoned years earlier. "There's a cabinet in his study with at least 6 rifles and 2 pistols, and I seen where he keeps the key." Sarah, Joanna's cabin mate, had connections with enslaved people on neighboring plantations through her work in the laundry, where she sometimes met with washerwomen from other estates. "Word is spreading," she reported. "People on the Morrison place and the Caldwell plantation are talking about freedom too. They're waiting to see what we do." The most valuable addition to their group was Moses, a middle-aged man who had been purchased by Beauregard just 2 years earlier after his previous master died. Moses brought with him knowledge of the outside world that proved invaluable to their planning. "I've been as far north as Memphis," he told them one night, his voice filled with the authority of experience. I seen free black folks living in their own houses, working for wages, sending their children to school. It ain't just a dream, it's real, and there's people white and black who help folks like us get there. Moses had heard stories of the Underground Railroad, the secret network of abolitionists who helped enslaved people escape to freedom in the North. More importantly, he knew of a contact in New Orleans, a free black man named Jacques Thibodeau, who worked as a dock worker but secretly helped fugitive slaves find passage on ships heading north. But getting to New Orleans ain't going to be easy, Moses warned. It's over 100 miles from here, and the roads are watched. We'd need supplies, weapons, and a plan for dealing with the slave catchers who patrol the area. As their planning intensified, Joanna found herself becoming the natural leader of the group. Her ability to read gave her access to information that the others couldn't obtain, and her fierce intelligence allowed her to see connections and possibilities that others missed. "We can't just run," she told them during one crucial meeting. "If we just try to escape, they'll hunt us down like animals. We need to strike back, to show them that we're not property to be owned and abused. We need to send a message that will inspire other enslaved people to rise up." The plan that emerged from their discussions was audacious in its scope and terrifying in its implications. They would strike on the night of the harvest moon in September, when the cotton picking was at its peak, and the overseers would be focused on the crops rather than security. The uprising would begin with the seizure of the weapons in the big house, followed by the liberation of all 50 enslaved people on the plantation. But Joanna's plan went further than simple escape. She intended to make Master Beauregard pay for his crimes against their people, to ensure that his death would serve as a warning to other slaveholders throughout Louisiana. "Some of you might think what I'm planning is wrong," she said to the group one night, her voice steady and determined. "Some of you might think that killing is always wrong, no matter what. But I want you to think about something. How many of our people has he killed? How many has he worked to death, beaten to death, sold away from their families to die of broken hearts?" The group was silent as they considered her words. Each of them had witnessed the casual cruelty that was part of daily life on the plantation, the way human beings were treated as nothing more than livestock to be worked until they dropped. "Master Beauregard ain't just one man," Joanna continued. "He's a symbol of everything that keeps us in chains. When we kill him, we're not just taking revenge, we're striking a blow for freedom that will echo across the South." Big Jim was the first to speak. "You're right, Joanna. I seen too many good people die under his whip. If we got the chance to end his evil, we got to take it." One by one, the others nodded their agreement. Even old Samuel, who had initially counseled caution, came to see the necessity of what they were planning. "My grandson Timothy is only 8 years old," Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion. "I want him to grow up free, not spend his whole life bowing and scraping to white folks who think they own him. If that means we got to fight, then we fight." As September approached, their preparations intensified. Mary used her access to the big house to create detailed maps of the building's layout, noting the location of weapons, the master's bedroom, and the best routes for moving through the house undetected. Moses and Big Jim scouted the roads leading away from the plantation, identifying the best route to New Orleans and the locations where they might encounter patrols. Joanna spent her evenings teaching the others basic military tactics she had read about in books stolen from the master's library. She showed them how to move silently, how to coordinate their attacks, and how to use improvised weapons effectively. "Remember," she told them, "surprise is our greatest advantage. They don't expect us to fight back because they've convinced themselves that we're too broken, too scared, too dependent on them to resist. We're going to show them how wrong they are." The psychological preparation was as important as the physical planning. For generations, enslaved people had been taught that resistance was futile, that their only hope lay in submission and obedience. Breaking through that conditioning required constant reinforcement of their cause and their capabilities. "We are not animals," Joanna would remind them. "We are not property. We are human beings with the same right to freedom as any white man. and we're going to claim that right, no matter what it costs." And as the harvest moon approached, tension on the plantation reached a fever pitch. The enslaved people went about their daily routines with apparent normalcy, but beneath the surface, a revolution was brewing. Weapons were secretly gathered and hidden. Knives from the kitchen, tools from the blacksmith shop, clubs carved from pieces of wood. The night before the uprising, Joanna gathered her conspirators one final time in the abandoned tobacco barn. The moonlight streaming through the broken roof illuminated their faces, showing a mixture of fear and determination that spoke to the magnitude of what they were about to attempt. "Tomorrow night, we change everything," she told them. "Tomorrow night, we stop being slaves and start being free people. Some of us might not survive what's coming, but those who do will carry the memory of our courage with them for the rest of their lives." She looked around the circle of faces, seeing in each one the reflection of her own desperate hope for freedom. "Are you ready?" she asked. "We are ready," they replied in unison, their voices carrying the weight of centuries of oppression and the promise of liberation. The die was cast. The uprising would begin at midnight. The harvest moon hung like a silver coin in the cloudless Louisiana sky as Joanna crept through the shadows toward the big house, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. Behind her, moving with the silent precision they had practiced for weeks, came Big Jim, Moses, and Mary, each carrying the improvised weapons they had carefully hidden over the past month. The plantation lay in deceptive quiet, the usual sounds of night, crickets chirping, owls calling, the distant lowing of cattle, masking the approaching storm that would forever change Magnolia Grove. In the slave quarters, the remaining conspirators waited for the signal that would tell them the uprising had begun. Joanna's first target was the overseer's house, where Thomas Whitman slept in blissful ignorance of the revolution brewing just yards away. The man who had administered countless beatings, who had separated families and broken spirits with casual cruelty, would be the first to pay for his crimes. The overseer's house was a modest two-story structure, far less grand than the main plantation house, but still a symbol of the hierarchy that kept enslaved people at the bottom of society. Joanna had studied its layout during her years on the plantation, noting the location of Whitman's bedroom window and the back door that he often left unlocked. Moving like a shadow, she slipped around to the rear of the house and tested the door handle. It turned easily in her hand, and she eased the door open just wide enough to slip inside. The house smelled of tobacco and whiskey, the odors of a man who indulged himself while denying basic human dignity to those under his control. Whitman's bedroom was on the second floor, and Joanna climbed the stairs with infinite care, avoiding the steps she knew would creak under her weight. The overseer's door was slightly ajar, and through the gap she could see his bulky form sprawled across the bed, snoring loudly after what had obviously been a night of heavy drinking. For a moment, Joanna hesitated. Despite all her planning and preparation, the reality of what she was about to do struck her with unexpected force. She was about to cross a line that could never be uncrossed, to commit an act that would mark her as a killer in the eyes of the law. But then she thought of old Martha, who had died from exhaustion just weeks earlier. She thought of young Peter, whose back would bear scars for the rest of his life. She thought of all the children who had been sold away from their mothers, all the families torn apart by the greed and cruelty of men like Whitman. The knife in her hand, a kitchen blade she had sharpened to razor keenness, felt heavy with the weight of justice as she approached the sleeping overseer. Whitman stirred slightly, muttering something in his sleep, but didn't wake. Joanna placed her hand over his mouth and drove the blade deep into his chest, angling upward toward his heart, just as Moses had taught her. Whitman's eyes flew open in shock and terror, but the sound that tried to escape his throat was muffled by her palm. He struggled briefly, his hands clawing at her arms, but the wound was mortal and his strength quickly faded. "This is for every person you ever hurt," Joanna whispered as the life left his eyes. "This is for every family you destroyed." She held him until his body went limp, then carefully withdrew the knife and wiped it clean on his bedsheets. The first blow for freedom had been struck. Moving quickly now, she made her way back downstairs and out of the house, where Big Jim was waiting in the shadows. "It's done," she whispered. Big Jim nodded grimly. "Moses and Mary are already at the big house. You ready for the next part?" Joanna looked toward the plantation mansion, its white columns gleaming in the moonlight like the pillars of a temple built to worship human bondage. Inside that house slept the man who had owned her body and soul for 28 years, who had bought and sold human beings like livestock, who had built his fortune on the suffering of her people. "I'm ready," she said. The big house presented a greater challenge than the overseer's residence. It was larger, with more potential witnesses, and Master Beauregard was known to keep a loaded pistol beside his bed. But Mary's intelligence gathering had provided them with crucial information about the layout and the habits of the household. They approached through the servants' entrance, using the key that Mary had secretly copied weeks earlier. The kitchen was dark and silent, the embers in the great fireplace providing the only light as they made their way through the familiar territory where Mary had worked countless hours without pay. "Master and mistress are in the main bedroom on the second floor," Mary whispered as they climbed the servants' stairs. "Their son Charles is away at college, and the guest rooms are empty." The main hallway of the second floor was lined with portraits of Beauregard ancestors, generations of slaveholders whose wealth had been built on human misery. Joanna felt their painted eyes watching her as she moved toward the master bedroom, and she wondered what they would think of the revolution that was about to unfold in their ancestral home. The bedroom door was closed but not locked. Joanna eased it open and peered inside, seeing the large four-poster bed where Master and Mistress Beauregard slept in luxury that had been purchased with the blood and sweat of enslaved people. Edmund Beauregard lay on his back, his face peaceful in sleep, completely unaware that his reign of terror was about to end. Beside him, his wife slept curled on her side, her graying hair spread across the silk pillowcase. Joanna entered the room alone, having decided that this final confrontation should be between her and the man who had owned her. She wanted him to see her face, to know who was ending his life and why. She placed the point of her knife against his throat and pressed just hard enough to draw a drop of blood. "Wake up, Master," she said quietly. Beauregard's eyes opened slowly, confusion giving way to shock as he realized what was happening. He started to speak, but Joanna pressed the knife deeper, silencing him. "Don't wake your wife," she whispered. "This is between you and me." Beauregard's eyes were wide with terror now, the same terror that enslaved people felt every day of their lives under his rule. For the first time in his privileged existence, he was completely powerless, completely at the mercy of another human being. "Do you remember me, Master?" Joanna asked, her voice soft but filled with deadly intent. "Do you remember the little girl you bought 26 years ago? The one you've beaten and worked and treated like an animal ever since?" Recognition dawned in Beauregard's eyes, along with a growing understanding of his fate. "I want you to know something before you die," Joanna continued. "Your plantation is finished, your slaves are free, and your death is going to inspire enslaved people across the South to rise up and claim their freedom." She saw the moment when Beauregard realized that his death was inevitable, saw the fear and rage and disbelief that flashed across his features. Then she drew the knife across his throat in one smooth motion, stepping back as his blood soaked into the expensive sheets. Mistress Beauregard stirred at the sound of her husband's final breath, but before she could fully wake, Mary was there with a pillow, smothering her cries before they could alert anyone else in the house. "It's done," Joanna said, looking down at the bodies of her former owners. "They can't hurt anyone ever again." The rest of the night passed in a blur of coordinated action. The conspirators moved through the plantation like avenging angels, freeing their fellow enslaved people and gathering supplies for the journey ahead. The weapons cabinet in Beauregard's study was broken open, providing rifles and ammunition for their protection. Some of the newly freed people were too frightened to leave, too conditioned by years of bondage to believe that freedom was possible, but most rallied to Joanna's call, understanding that this was their one chance to escape the hell of slavery. "We're not just running away," Joanna told them as they gathered in the pre-dawn darkness. "We're fighting our way to freedom, and we're going to show every slaveholder in Louisiana that their time is coming to an end." The group that set out from Magnolia Grove Plantation in the early hours of September 15, 1860, consisted of 43 people, men, women, and children who had chosen freedom over security, danger over bondage. They carried with them the weapons they had seized, supplies they had gathered, and most importantly, the knowledge that they had struck a blow against the institution of slavery that would echo throughout the South. Behind them, the plantation house burned against the morning sky, the flames consuming not just a building, but a way of life built on human suffering. The smoke could be seen for miles, a signal to enslaved people throughout the region that the impossible had happened, that resistance was not only possible but successful. As they disappeared into the Louisiana wilderness, Joanna looked back one last time at the place that had been her prison for 28 years. The fire was spreading now, consuming the overseer's house and the outbuildings, erasing the physical symbols of her bondage. But more importantly, the fire of freedom was spreading too, carried in the hearts of 43 people who had chosen to risk everything for the chance to live as human beings rather than property. The uprising had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. Now came the even greater challenge of staying free. The Louisiana bayous stretched endlessly before the group of fugitives as they made their way through the treacherous swampland, following Moses's lead as he navigated by the stars and his memories of the route to New Orleans. 3 days had passed since the uprising at Magnolia Grove, and already they could hear the distant baying of bloodhounds echoing across the wetlands. "They're getting closer," Big Jim said grimly as he helped old Samuel navigate a particularly treacherous stretch of marshy ground. The elderly man's bent back made the journey even more difficult for him, but he refused to be left behind or to slow the group's progress. "How much further to the safe house?" asked Sarah, who was carrying young Timothy on her back. The 8-year-old boy had been struggling with the pace, and his small legs simply couldn't keep up with the adults. Moses paused to check their position against the constellation overhead. "Maybe 10 more miles through the swamp, then another 5 through the city to reach Jacques Thibodeau's place. But we got to be careful. New Orleans is crawling with slave catchers, and word of what we did has probably reached every bounty hunter in Louisiana by now." The news of the Magnolia Grove uprising had indeed spread like wildfire throughout the South. The brutal killing of Master Beauregard and Overseer Whitman, combined with the successful escape of over 40 enslaved people, had sent shockwaves through the plantation system. Rewards totaling $5,000 had been posted for Joanna's capture, dead or alive, making her one of the most wanted fugitives in the region. "Let them come," Joanna said, checking the rifle she had taken from Beauregard's gun cabinet. "We didn't come this far just to be dragged back in chains." The group had been forced to split up twice during their journey when patrols got too close, reuniting at predetermined locations deeper in the swamp. They had lost 7 people along the way, not to capture, but to fear. When the reality of their situation had fully sunk in, when they realized they were now fugitives with prices on their heads, some had chosen to turn back and face whatever punishment awaited them rather than continue the dangerous journey to freedom. "Can't say I blame them," Mary had said when the last group of deserters disappeared back into the swamp. "This ain't easy, and there's no guarantee we're going to make it." "Freedom was never going to be easy," Joanna had replied. "If it was easy, we would have been free a long time ago." The remaining 36 fugitives had proven themselves to be made of sterner stuff. They included families like Samuel and his grandson Timothy, individuals like Moses, who had tasted freedom before and would do anything to regain it, and young people like Mary, who were willing to risk everything for the chance at a different life. As they pushed deeper into the bayou, the landscape around them became increasingly surreal and dangerous. Ancient cypress trees draped with Spanish moss created a canopy that blocked out much of the moonlight, while alligators slid silently through the dark water and poisonous snakes hung from low-hanging branches. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of decay, and every step had to be carefully placed to avoid sinking into the treacherous mud. "This place gives me the creeps," whispered one of the younger men, jumping at every sound in the darkness. "Better to be scared and free than comfortable and enslaved," replied Big Jim, who had appointed himself as one of Joanna's lieutenants during the journey. The group had developed a system for moving through the dangerous terrain. Moses led the way, using his knowledge of the swamp to find the safest paths. Joanna and Big Jim brought up the rear, watching for signs of pursuit and ready to fight a delaying action if necessary. The others moved in small groups between them, helping each other navigate the obstacles and keeping watch for dangers both human and natural. On the fourth night of their journey, they encountered their first real test. A patrol of slave catchers, led by the notorious bounty hunter Jake Morrison, had anticipated their route and set up an ambush at a narrow causeway that was the only way across a particularly treacherous stretch of swamp. 6 men with rifles, Moses reported after scouting ahead. "They're dug in good, and there's no way around them without adding 2 days to our journey." "2 days we don't have," Joanna said, studying the situation through the darkness. "The bloodhounds are getting closer, and we're running low on food and ammunition." The causeway was perhaps 50 yards long and only wide enough for 2 people to walk abreast. On either side lay deep water filled with alligators and water moccasins. It was a perfect killing ground, designed to force the fugitives into a frontal assault against prepared positions. "We could wait until dawn and try to pick them off one by one," suggested Big Jim. "No," Joanna said firmly. "By dawn, they'll have reinforcements. We go now, while we still have the advantage of darkness." She gathered the group's best fighters, Big Jim, Moses, Mary, and 3 other men who had shown courage and skill during their journey. "The rest of you stay here with the children and the elderly. If we don't make it, you find another way around and keep going to New Orleans." "Joanna," old Samuel said, grabbing her arm with surprising strength, "you don't have to do this. We could find another way." "There is no other way," she replied gently. "This is what freedom costs. This is what we knew we'd have to pay when we started this journey." The attack began with Moses and one of the other men circling wide to the left, using the cover of the cypress trees to get as close as possible to the slave catcher's position. Meanwhile, Joanna led Big Jim and the others in a frontal assault designed to draw the defenders' attention. The first shots rang out across the swamp like thunder, muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness as the 2 sides exchanged fire. Joanna felt a bullet whistle past her ear as she dove for cover behind a fallen log, the rifle in her hands bucking as she returned fire. "There!" Big Jim shouted, pointing to one of the slave catchers who had exposed himself while reloading. Joanna's shot took the man in the chest, spinning him around before he toppled into the dark water below. The battle was fierce but brief. The slave catchers had expected to face frightened, poorly armed fugitives, not determined fighters who had already proven their willingness to kill for freedom. When Moses and his companion opened fire from their flanking position, catching the defenders in a crossfire, the remaining slave catchers broke and ran. Jake Morrison himself was the last to flee, but not before Joanna put a bullet through his shoulder, sending him stumbling into the swamp with a scream of pain and rage. "Let him go," Big Jim said when Joanna raised her rifle for a finishing shot. "Let him spread the word about what happens to people who try to drag us back to slavery." The cost of the victory was high. One of their fighters had been killed, and 2 others were wounded, including Mary, who had taken a bullet in the leg. But the causeway was clear, and the group was able to continue their journey toward New Orleans. "You did good," Moses told Joanna as they helped carry the wounded across the narrow bridge. "You fought like a general." "I fought like a free woman," Joanna replied. and I'll keep fighting until every one of our people has the same chance." The final approach to New Orleans required a different kind of courage. The city was a maze of narrow streets and crowded neighborhoods where a group of fugitive slaves would stand out like a beacon. They had to split up into smaller groups and make their way separately to Jacques Thibodeau's warehouse near the docks. Joanna entered the city with just Big Jim and Moses, leaving the others hidden in the swamp until they could confirm that their contact was reliable and that safe passage could be arranged. The streets of New Orleans were unlike anything she had ever seen, a mixture of French, Spanish, and American influences that created a unique culture where free people of color lived and worked alongside whites and enslaved people. "There," Moses said, pointing to a weathered building near the Mississippi River. "That's Jacques' place." The warehouse was a rambling structure that had seen better days, its walls stained with decades of river moisture and its windows covered with heavy curtains that blocked any view of the interior. A small sign by the door identified it as Thibodeau Import-Export, but there was no indication of the dangerous work that went on inside. Jacques Thibodeau himself was a surprise, a small, wiry man in his 50s with skin the color of café au lait and eyes that seemed to see everything while revealing nothing. He greeted Moses with obvious relief and listened intently as Joanna explained their situation. 43 people started the journey, she said. 35 made it this far. We need passage north, and we need it soon. The slave catchers are right behind us." Jacques nodded thoughtfully. "I heard about what you did at Magnolia Grove. Word is, you killed Beauregard and his overseer with your own hands." "I did what needed to be done," Joanna replied simply. "Good," Jacques said with a grim smile. "That bastard had it coming, but it's made things more difficult. Every bounty hunter in the South is looking for you, and the rewards are higher than I've ever seen." He walked over to a large map of the Mississippi River that hung on his office wall. "I can get you passage on a steamboat heading upriver, but it won't be comfortable. You'll be hidden in the cargo hold with supplies for maybe a week, depending on how many stops we make." "What about the others?" Big Jim asked. "The wounded, the children, the elderly. They'll have to manage like everyone else," Jacques said bluntly. "This isn't a pleasure cruise. It's a desperate run for freedom, and not everyone who starts the journey finishes it." As they finalized the arrangements for their escape, Joanna couldn't help but think about how far they had come from that night at Magnolia Grove. They had struck a blow against slavery that would be remembered for generations, but the price had been high, and the journey was far from over. "When do we leave?" she asked. "Tomorrow night," Jacques replied. "There's a steamboat called the River Queen that's heading upriver to St. Louis. From there, you'll have to make your own way to Canada or the Free States." Joanna nodded, already planning the next phase of their journey. They had come too far to fail now, and she was determined that every person who had followed her this far would have the chance to taste true freedom. The final leg of their escape was about to begin. The steamboat River Queen cut through the muddy waters of the Mississippi River like a knife through chocolate, its paddle wheel churning up foam as it carried its hidden cargo of freedom seekers toward the promise of liberty in the north. In the cramped cargo hold below deck, 35 former slaves huddled together in the darkness, their bodies pressed against bales of cotton in a bitter irony that was not lost on any of them. "How much longer?" whispered young Timothy, his small voice barely audible over the constant rumble of the steam engine above their heads. "Not much longer now," Joanna replied softly, though she had no real way of knowing. They had been on the river for 6 days, and according to Jacques Thibodeau's calculations, they should be approaching St. Louis soon. But time moved differently in the suffocating darkness of the cargo hold, where day and night blended together into an endless twilight of hope and fear. The journey upriver had not been without its dangers. Twice the boat had been stopped by river patrols, searching for fugitive slaves, and each time the group had held their breath in the darkness, knowing that discovery would mean death or a return to bondage that would be worse than death. The ship's captain, a gruff Irishman named Patrick O'Malley, had proven to be a reliable ally, but even he couldn't completely control who came aboard his vessel. "River Patrol coming alongside," came O'Malley's voice through the speaking tube that connected the cargo hold to the pilot house. "Stay quiet as the grave down there." The sound of boots on the deck above their heads made everyone freeze in place. Joanna could hear muffled voices as the patrol officers questioned Captain O'Malley about his cargo and destination. One of the children started to whimper, but his mother quickly covered his mouth with her hand. "Just cotton and tobacco heading to St. Louis," O'Malley was saying. "Nothing unusual about that." "We've had reports of fugitive slaves using river transport," came the reply in a voice that carried the authority of law enforcement. "Mind if we take a look around?" Joanna's hand tightened on the rifle she had managed to keep hidden throughout their journey. If they were discovered now, so close to freedom, she was prepared to fight rather than surrender. Around her, she could sense the same determination in the others who had come this far. "Of course, officer," O'Malley replied smoothly. "Though I should warn you, we've got some cargo that's been giving off a powerful smell. Might want to hold your breath when you go below." The footsteps moved across the deck, and Joanna could hear the patrol officers discussing whether it was worth investigating the lower holds. After what seemed like an eternity, the voices moved away, and eventually the sound of another boat's engine indicated that the patrol had moved on. "All clear," came O'Malley's voice through the speaking tube. "We'll be in St. Louis by tomorrow morning." The relief in the cargo hold was palpable, but Joanna knew that their greatest challenges still lay ahead. St. Louis was a border city where slavery was legal, but where there was also a significant population of free blacks and abolitionists. It would be easier to blend in there, but it would also be crawling with slave catchers looking for the fugitives from Magnolia Grove. "What's the plan when we reach St. Louis?" Big Jim asked quietly. "We split up into smaller groups," Joanna replied. "It's safer that way, and it makes us harder to track. Some will head for Chicago, others for Detroit or Buffalo. The important thing is to get across the border into Canada as quickly as possible." "What about you?" Moses asked. "You've got the biggest bounty on your head. Every slave catcher in the country is looking for you." Joanna had been thinking about that question throughout their journey. The $5,000 reward for her capture was more money than most people saw in a lifetime, and it made her a target wherever she went. But she had also come to realize that her role in the uprising had made her something more than just a fugitive. She had become a symbol of resistance that could inspire others to fight for their freedom. "I'm going back," she said simply. The words hung in the air like a physical presence, and for a moment, no one spoke. "Back where?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. "Back to Louisiana, back to the plantations. There are thousands of our people still in chains, still suffering under masters like Beauregard. They need to know that freedom is possible, that they can fight back and win." "Joanna, that's suicide," Big Jim protested. "Every white man in the South will be looking for you. You'll never make it a week." "Maybe not," Joanna admitted. "But if I can inspire even one more uprising, if I can help even one more group of enslaved people escape to freedom, then it will be worth it." Old Samuel, who had been quiet throughout the journey, finally spoke up. "You've already done more than anyone could ask. You've earned your freedom. You don't owe anyone else anything." "Yes, I do," Joanna replied firmly. "I owe it to every person who's still in chains. I owe it to every child who's going to be born into slavery. I owe it to every woman who's going to be separated from her family, every man who's going to be worked to death in the fields." She looked around at the faces of her companions, seeing in their eyes the same mixture of admiration and concern that she had come to know so well. "The uprising at Magnolia Grove was just the beginning," she continued. "It showed that enslaved people can fight back, that we can win. But it was just one plantation. One small victory in a much larger war. If we're going to end slavery, we need more uprisings, more victories, more proof that freedom is worth fighting for." When the River Queen docked in St. Louis the next morning, The group of fugitives emerged from the cargo hold like ghosts returning to the world of the living. The city was bustling with activity, merchants loading and unloading cargo, passengers boarding boats for destinations up and down the river, and the general chaos of a major transportation hub. Captain O'Malley had arranged for them to disembark in small groups, blending in with the regular passengers and crew members. Joanna was among the last to leave, taking a moment to thank the Irishman who had risked his livelihood and possibly his life to help them. "You're a brave woman, Joanna," O'Malley said as she prepared to step onto the dock, "but you're also a marked woman. Be careful out there." "I will," she promised, "and thank you for everything." The group's final gathering took place in a safe house operated by the Underground Railroad, a modest building in the free black section of St. Louis where they could rest and plan their next moves. It was there that they said their goodbyes, knowing that they might never see each other again. "You saved us all," Mary said, embracing Joanna with tears in her eyes. "I'll never forget what you did for us." "Take care of that leg," Joanna replied, referring to the wound Mary had suffered in their fight with the slave catchers. "And remember, you're free now. Don't let anyone ever make you forget that." One by one, the others said their farewells. Big Jim promised to write letters to abolitionist newspapers telling the story of their uprising. Moses planned to work with the Underground Railroad to help other fugitives reach freedom. Old Samuel and young Timothy were heading for Canada, where they could start a new life without fear of being recaptured. "What you did will be remembered," Samuel told Joanna as he prepared to leave. "Generations from now, people will tell stories about the woman who killed her master and led her people to freedom." "I hope they'll tell stories about the end of slavery," Joanna replied. "That's what really matters." As her companions dispersed to begin their new lives as free people, Joanna began planning her return to the South. She had contacts among the Underground Railroad who could help her move safely through hostile territory, and she had already identified several plantations where conditions were ripe for uprising. The news of the Magnolia Grove Rebellion had indeed spread throughout the South, just as she had hoped. Plantation owners were increasing security and treating their enslaved people with even greater harshness. But they were also inadvertently spreading the message that resistance was possible. Every harsh punishment, every increased restriction, every fearful glance from a white overseer served as proof that the system of slavery was not as secure as it had once seemed. 3 months after the uprising, Joanna was back in Louisiana, moving through the network of safe houses and sympathetic contacts that made up the Underground Railroad. She had changed her appearance as much as possible, cutting her hair short, darkening her skin with walnut stain, and adopting the posture and mannerisms of a field hand rather than the confident bearing of a leader. But her reputation preceded her wherever she went. Enslaved people throughout the region had heard the story of the woman who had killed Master Beauregard and led 43 people to freedom. Some of the stories were exaggerated, turning her into a figure of almost mythical proportions. But the core truth remained: resistance was possible, and freedom could be won. "Is it true what they say about you?" asked a young man named David on a plantation outside Baton Rouge. "Did you really kill your master with your own hands?" "I did what needed to be done," Joanna replied, the same answer she had given countless times over the past months. "And you can do the same thing if you have the courage." Over the following year, Joanna helped organize 3 more uprisings, each one building on the lessons learned at Magnolia Grove. Not all of them were successful. 2 were discovered before they could begin, resulting in brutal reprisals against the conspirators. But the 3rd, at a sugar plantation near New Orleans, resulted in the liberation of 67 enslaved people and the death of another brutal master. The pattern was always the same: careful planning, the recruitment of trusted allies, the seizure of weapons, and the coordinated strike that would free as many people as possible while sending a message that would inspire others to resist. But Joanna knew that her luck couldn't last forever. The bounty on her head had grown to $10,000, making her one of the most wanted fugitives in American history. Every day she remained in the South increased the chances that she would be captured or killed. The end came, as she had always known it would, in a blaze of gunfire and defiance. Surrounded by a posse of slave catchers in a cypress swamp outside New Orleans, Joanna made her final stand with a rifle in her hands and the knowledge that she had already accomplished more than she had ever dared to dream. "Surrender, and we'll take you alive," shouted the leader of the posse. "I'd rather die free than live as a slave," Joanna shouted back and opened fire. The battle was brief but fierce. When the smoke cleared, Joanna lay dead beside the bodies of 3 slave catchers, her rifle empty, but her spirit unbroken. But her legacy lived on. The story of Joanna's uprising at Magnolia Grove became a rallying cry for abolitionists throughout the North and a source of inspiration for enslaved people throughout the South. Within 5 years, the tensions her actions had helped to create would contribute to the outbreak of the Civil War, and within a decade, the institution of slavery would be abolished forever. Her name was whispered in slave quarters from Virginia to Texas, passed down through generations as a reminder that freedom was worth any sacrifice. Children who had never known her personally grew up hearing stories of the woman who had refused to accept bondage, who had struck back against her oppressors, and who had proven that even the most powerless could change the course of history. In the years following the Civil War, when former slaves were finally free to tell their stories openly, Joanna's uprising was remembered as one of the most significant acts of resistance in the history of American slavery. Historians would debate the exact details of what happened at Magnolia Grove, but the essential truth remained unchanged. A woman who had been treated as property had risen up to claim her humanity, and in doing so had helped to light the fire that would eventually burn down the entire system of human bondage. The 43 people who had followed her to freedom never forgot what she had done for them. Big Jim became a successful businessman in Chicago, using his wealth to support the Underground Railroad and later the Union Army during the Civil War. Mary became a teacher, dedicating her life to educating the children of former slaves. Old Samuel and young Timothy settled in Canada, where Timothy grew up to become a doctor who provided free medical care to fugitive slaves. Each of them carried Joanna's story with them, sharing it with their children and grandchildren, ensuring that her legacy would never be forgotten. They spoke of her courage, her intelligence, her unwavering commitment to freedom, and her willingness to sacrifice everything for the liberation of her people. But perhaps the most fitting tribute to Joanna's memory came from the enslaved people who continued to resist after her death. Inspired by her example, they organized their own uprisings, their own escapes, their own acts of defiance against the system that sought to dehumanize them. Each act of resistance, no matter how small, carried forward the spirit of the woman who had shown them that freedom was not a gift to be granted by others, but a right to be claimed by any means necessary. In the slave quarters of Louisiana plantations, mothers would tell their children about Joanna before putting them to sleep, describing her not as a distant historical figure, but as a real woman who had faced the same hardships they faced, who had felt the same pain they felt, and who had found the strength to fight back. "Remember," they would say, "you are not property, you are not animals, you are human beings with the same right to freedom as anyone else." And if Joanna could claim that freedom, so can you. The plantation system tried to suppress these stories, to erase Joanna's memory from the historical record, but they could not silence the truth that lived in the hearts of the oppressed. Her legacy was written not in official documents or newspaper accounts, but in the courage of every person who refused to accept injustice, in the determination of every individual who chose resistance over submission. When the Emancipation Proclamation was signed in 1863, freeing all enslaved people in the rebellious states, many of the former slaves who celebrated that day remembered Joanna's words, "We are not property. We are not animals. We are human beings with the same right to freedom as any white man." She had spoken those words in the darkness of a Louisiana swamp. surrounded by people who had been told their entire lives that they were inferior, that they were destined for bondage, that resistance was futile. But she had proven that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit could not be broken, that the desire for freedom could not be extinguished, and that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they found the courage to act. The Magnolia Grove Uprising of 1860 lasted only one night, but its impact echoed through the decades that followed. It demonstrated that enslaved people were not passive victims, but active agents of their own liberation, capable of planning, organizing, and executing complex military operations against their oppressors. More importantly, it showed that the system of slavery was not invincible, that it could be challenged and defeated by people who had been systematically denied education, weapons, and legal rights. Joanna and her followers had proven that courage and determination could overcome even the most overwhelming odds. In the years after the Civil War, as the United States struggled to rebuild itself on the foundation of freedom rather than slavery, Joanna's story became a source of inspiration for the ongoing fight for civil rights. Her example reminded people that freedom was not a destination, but a journey, that the work of liberation was never finished, and that each generation had to fight its own battles against injustice and oppression. The woman who had been born into bondage on a Louisiana plantation, who had been bought and sold like livestock, who had been beaten and humiliated and treated as less than human, had ultimately achieved something that no amount of wealth or power could buy. She had become truly free, not just in body but in spirit. And in freeing herself, she had helped to free a nation from the moral stain of slavery, proving that sometimes the most profound changes in history begin with a single act of courage by an ordinary person who refuses to accept the unacceptable. Joanna's bloody uprising had lasted only one night, but her legacy of liberation would last forever. The end. Important notice. This story is completely fictional and created for entertainment purposes only. All characters, events, situations, and circumstances are products of imagination and do not represent real people, living or dead, or real events. Any resemblance to actual persons or situations is purely coincidental. This narrative is a work of historical fiction that explores themes of resistance and freedom, but it should not be considered an accurate historical account of any specific events or individuals. This powerful historical fiction explores themes of resistance, courage, and the human desire for freedom in the face of systemic oppression. Through the character of Joanna, it examines how ordinary people can become catalysts for extraordinary change when they refuse to accept injustice. The story demonstrates that while the fight for freedom often requires tremendous sacrifice, the impact of such courage can echo through generations, inspiring others to continue the struggle for human dignity and equality.